continuing with our series, You Don't Know My Name, which explores some of the stories of unnamed women in the Gospels. Today is also Resurrection Sunday, the day where we gather with much of the church to celebrate the reality that death doesn't have the last word and that new life is possible. So today we are going to talk about both of those things. We will talk about them from the perspective of an unnamed woman who has her story told in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But we will primarily look at her story from within the Gospel of Matthew, but we'll lean on the other two Gospel writers occasionally for details here and there. This woman has been suffering from hemorrhaging blood for 12 years. She has spent her entire life's savings, all the money she has to live on doctors who have failed to stop the bleeding and cures that have been unable to heal her. These pursuits have left her penniless and even more desperate to find healing for the bleeding. This woman is from the same region of Galilee as Jesus and has heard the fantastical stories of people being healed from all sorts of infirmities. Do I dare hope again that I could be healed? Do I put myself out there again, risking further shame? She thought to herself. As part of the rituals pertaining to purity and health, her 12 years of bleeding have made her a social pariah. She has been unable to participate in the social life of her community, forced to stay away from others for fear of what is causing her bleeding could be contagious and could contaminate them. Every time she leaves her house, she has to deal with people crossing the street to avoid accidentally touching her. She has to deal with the indignant stares of people annoyed at her very existence. If she was not already feeling so weak from the constant bleeding, the stares tried to drain her of the rest of her resolve. She began to hear people mustering outside. Excitement seems to be in the air. So she goes to her doorway to see if she can figure out what is going on. Jesus is coming this way, somebody yells from the street. Somebody else yells, I heard he is on his way to Jairus' house. Jairus' daughter has just died. The woman has heard enough. This is the moment she has been waiting for. She put on her outer garment, her shawl, and begins to slink her way through the crowd. She was used to getting where she needed to go without anybody noticing her, as if she had figured out the secret to becoming invisible. She makes her way through the crowd until she's a mere feet away from Jesus. And before she could think twice, she came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she had said to herself, if I could only touch his garment, I will be made well. And in the instant that she touched the hem of Jesus' garment, the bleeding stopped. She could feel the change in her body. Suddenly, Jesus stopped and with an alarmed look began to ask the crowd who touched him. The crowd looked at him with puzzled faces. Even his disciples tried to tell him it was impossible to tell who in the midst of such a crowd. Peter stepped forward in the way that he does and says, Master, the crowds surround you and are pressing in on you from every side. To which Jesus replied, Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me. Jesus didn't seem to want to let this go. The woman, seeing that it was impossible to remain hidden what she had done, came and bowed down in front of Jesus and proceeded to explain to Jesus why she had touched him and how she was healed the moment she laid hands on him. At that moment, Jesus saw this woman who had hidden away for so long. Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well. The woman stood up and began to walk away, but instead of feeling shame at the whisper she could hear all around her, she felt a sense of new life and new possibility bubbling inside her like a wellspring that could not be contained. This, as much as any story in the Bible about new life, is a resurrection story about the possibility of new creation. This is a story about a woman whose whole life was controlled by something that sought to kill her, to drain the life from her body one blood droplet at a time. This is a story about how this woman, against social pressure, in her desperation, sought her liberation, and no one could hold her back. This is a story of a woman who was marginalized at the intersection of her gender and her medical condition in a society that had little time or patience for either. Yet, Through her will and tenacity, she procured for herself that which no one else was able to or willing to give her. This is the power of those who have nothing left to lose. Remember, the story tells us that she had spent everything she had to live on in hopes of finding a cure, adding a third point at which she was marginalized: gender, illness, and now poverty. But it is from this place that the woman refuses to be marginalized any longer. She refuses to obey the social conventions and rules. She goes where she was not supposed to go or wanted. She does what she was not supposed to do, and as a result, she procures her healing. To me, this story highlights the reality that God is always on the side of and with the oppressed in this world. So much so that even when Jesus does not see this woman, God's power still flowed out to her. Even when you do not feel seen by God, this woman shows us that God's power can still flow out to you. The shock that Jesus displays at the loss of power, figuratively and literally, as he was powerless to stop this woman, and that power went out from him without his permission. So the shock that Jesus displays is the shock that power always has when it feels like it is not in control. The expected response from power would be to see Jesus chastise and punish this woman for stepping out of place. But that is not Jesus' response. Jesus sees this woman, he calls her daughter, and sends her on her way with a benediction of faith and wholeness. Instead of lamenting his loss of power, Jesus affirms this woman in a way that she had not been in so long or possibly ever. Jesus becomes a co-conspirator with this woman in her liberation. Now, the temptation that we will have is to say how strong, how brave, how courageous this woman was to step out and do what she needed to do to get what she needed to get in a world that tried to marginalize her. But we must resist this temptation. We must not rest on the fact that she had to do what she had to do and that was courageous and strong because it was. But we must look deeper. Her points of marginalization made it necessary for her to have to play the role of a brave and strong woman. But I think we have an opportunity to go beyond the author's intent. Because if we're honest with ourselves, the author's intent in this story is to use this woman as a prop in the play of Jesus. It is fantastical that this woman was healed, but it is a tragedy that she was marginalized in the first place. Two quotes, first from Brittany C. Cooper and the second from Joan Morgan, have been sitting with me as I reflect on this story of the woman with the issue of blood. And just a trigger warning, there is a little bit of language in these quotes, but I wanted to be faithful to the people who quoted them. First, real radicalism implores us to tell the whole ugly truth, even when it is inconvenient, to own the hurt and the pain, to own our shit too, to think about it systemically and collectively, but never to diminish the import of the trauma. And then second, I did a quick mental check of the popular epithets: strong black woman, womanist, warrior woman, Nubian queen, bitch, gangster bitch, bitches with problems, hoes with attitudes. None of them offered even the hint of protection. This is not to be confused with being a strong black woman, and a woman. I am still all of that. I draw strength daily from the history of struggle and survival that is a black woman's spiritual legacy. What I kicked to the curb was the years of social conditioning that told me it was my destiny to live my life as a black superwoman emeritus by the sole virtues of my race and gender. These quotes have danced around in my head as I reflected on the story because they call into question the systems behind this unnamed woman's trauma. Her trauma was not simply that she was bleeding for 12 years. Her trauma was based in rejection, isolation, and exploitation. Like her, we still live in a society that does not take the pain of women seriously and does not believe women when they share their pain. often leaving the narrative of the strong and courageous woman as the only path forward for her, as it was for the woman in this story. I feel this urge in me to wrap up in a neat package today this story in a way that allows us to walk away with a moralizing principle like Jesus healed her. But that isn't the story. The story is that this woman was healed, yes, but it is also of all the other points that allow this woman's story just to be told in service of Jesus' story, to the fact that we do not even know her name. Maybe the point is that we need to sit with, maybe the point that we need to sit with is, why didn't Jesus ask her her name? Why didn't the all-knowing God speak her name from the heavens? Why was this woman oppressed to the point where she had to get into, to quote John Lewis, some good trouble to procure her healing? But even with all those questions, let us heed what this woman taught us. That being seen by power is not a condition of your liberation. And that God, even when God does not see the oppressed, cannot help but flow out in the cause of liberation.